Hello everyone, and welcome back to Isaiah from Mormons. Today we're going to be doing chapter 28 of Isaiah. We're going to be doing some interesting things this week, and I just wanted to talk to you briefly before we begin about why I'm doing this the way that I am. I sometimes will give things to you in something of a choppy way, but I want you to remember that there is actually a lot of unity here, and I try to bring out the unity. In recent discussions, I've tried to show that even though I may be talking about the Isaiah apocalypse like it's a bunch of different little pieces, which it might have been at some point, somebody has edited it together quite well to make logical sense. Or maybe even it did originally make logical sense and flow well together, but interruptions make it look like it's little pieces. Editors have made it look like it should be broken into small pieces. So that's the continuously difficult thing to know. I'm going to err on the side of unity because scholars have had a tendency to do the opposite, to just cut the text into little tiny bits and then try to study the bits. I mean, it's like taking a beautiful painting, turning the painting into confetti, and then studying the confetti. Okay, interesting perhaps, but why not study the painting? So that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to try to study it more broadly, perhaps, than what other people might do. And so, with that in mind, I'd like to show that there may be a translation issue that might make you say that 27, traditionally considered the last bit of the Isaiah apocalypse, is actually supposed to be combined with 28, and that there is actually a pretty good narrative flow from all the way back in 24, and even in some ways through 23, all the way through to what we even have now. So that chapter 23 through now and just continuously can be seen as one flowing narrative. Now that's, people might object to that. I know a lot of scholars who would object to that, but that isn't to say that this is all one speech. I'm not convinced that all of this is really one speech necessarily. Well, it could be. But what's more likely is that somebody has edited it together well. There's one part where I'm quite confident, actually a couple of times, where I'm quite confident somebody has just tried to stitch things together and that they've kind of done a bad job of it. And that things that look unified actually are not, but many things that don't look unified really are. And that's the difficult thing about Isaiah, right? People love Isaiah, and because they love it, they've hacked it to bits and reassembled it and changed this and that and everything else, so that it is very difficult to see what was originally happening. It's fantastic to have the Joseph Smith translation in the Book of Mormon, because on those occasions you can see that although the differences actually are small, the impact made on the text is huge. I talk a lot about the Septuagint, and I don't want you to think that the Septuagint is actually exactly what Isaiah said. But I think that often the Septuagint does preserve the sense of what Isaiah said. It may be something of an imaginative reinterpretation at times, okay? But even if it is a loose translation, I think it preserves the sense better sometimes than the Hebrew does. Sometimes, I think often, as we saw in the analysis of the Book of Mormon text, the Hebrew may just be changed, a word here, maybe a sentence there. But those changes amount to real, genuine changes in content. Sometimes just one letter difference can change an entire context for a chapter. We may talk about this later when we talk about people who are lived around the time of Isaiah, because there are some of those books that have those problems. But I think that we can see that also in the book of Isaiah. So that's one of the major problems that we encounter as we're going through the text. And this, I think, is something that we're encountering here in 28. It looks like he's talking about Ephraim, and it looks like he's talking about the capital of the city, the capital city of Ephraim. But I'm not convinced. And once again, we have to read Isaiah as more of a unity in order to see that. So let's do that. Let's go back to 27. You guys remember last time, 27. This is God kind of gathering everybody in from the ends of the earth. Where are they gathering to? They're gathering to Jerusalem. And it shall come to pass at that day that the great trumpet shall be blown, and they shall come which were ready to perish in the land of Assyria, and the outcasts in the land of Egypt, and shall worship the Lord in the holy mount at Jerusalem. Now that's what we see here. Worshipping the Lord in the holy mount at Jerusalem. But Jerusalem's not the only holy mount in Israel and Judah. There are other places of worship in the Holy Land. You'll recall, I think we've talked about this before, the northern kingdom broke away, and the first king of the northern kingdom established places of worship at Dan and Bethel. And the text continuously is harping about his sins that he did in committing this, the sins he committed in creating these. Now, it's difficult to know how terrible this was. These could have just been pre-existing sites that he maybe even just restored, or once again, it's hard to know exactly how good or bad this was. But regardless, it seems like they are having a tough time at this point. That regardless of the origins, which may have been good or bad, depending on how you interpret that, it's very difficult to tell, actually. Regardless of that, at this point, the cultic sites, the temples at Dan and Bethel, cultic site, that's a word you can throw around in small social circles, it just means temple. The temples at Dan and Bethel are not exactly living up to what they should be. And he is, I think, punning on that here. So, Isaiah 28:1. I'll just read you a little bit to give you some of the sense. Woe to the crown of pride, to the drunkards of Ephraim, whose glorious beauty is a fading flower, which are on the head of the fat valleys of them that are overcome with wine. Behold, the Lord hath a mighty and strong one, which as a tempest of hail and a destroying storm, as a flood of mighty waters overflowing, shall cast down to the earth with the hand. The crown of pride, the drunkards of Ephraim, shall be trodden under feet, and the glorious beauty which is on the head of the fat valley shall be a fading flower, and as the hasty fruit before the summer, which, when he that looketh upon it seeth, while it is yet in his hand, he eateth it up. In that day shall the Lord of hosts be for a crown of glory, and for a diadem of beauty unto the residue of his people, and for a spirit of judgment to him that sitteth in judgment, and for strength to them that turn the battle to the gate. Now, you have to understand something about Hebrew. That is, that it is very ambiguous. Isaiah is always making puns. Why? Because the language is ambiguous, and it allows him to do all kinds of crazy things with the language. He's a master craftsman of the language. And that can't be discounted when we're reading Isaiah. He is a craftsman of the language. And that's what we see here. Woe to the crown of pride. So clearly he's talking about something that you would wear on your head, a crown. To the drunkards of Ephraim. Okay, so he's condemning them for their drunkenness. Whose glorious beauty is a fading flower. Now, okay, great, fading flower. If flowers that are, that are dying, presumably, which are on the head of the fat valleys of them that are overcome with wine. So he says, so it's not really. He's comparing the crown on their heads to the heads of the drunkards to the flowers that are at the head of the valleys. It's kind of strange. And people have said, this is like the city. The major capital city of Ephraim is at the head of the valley. So he's saying it's like, hey, like you have nice flowers in the valleys that fade. The city's fading. Well, okay, fine. But it could be that this has been understood badly later on. So let's look at another possibility for what this could mean. And once again, it could also be a pun. We'll talk about that in a second. So the fading flower there, the word flower, is the same as the word for plate. The metal plate that Aaron wears on his head, it's the same word there as the word for flower. Well, you'll remember in Exodus, Aaron has a metal plate that he wears on his head. He has a kind of a hat sort of a thing, almost a turban, I would say. On the front of this hat is a metal plate, and it has the words "Holiness to the Lord" or "Consecrated to the Lord" engraved on it. That's why we have that on our temples today. So he has this plate on his hat, and that is exactly the same word. Now you can imagine, over time, people are using this for generation after generation. If they pick it up every day to put it on, or whenever they have to wear the vestments, it's possible that it would fade away over time, that you would wear the gold so much that it would actually fade. So, let's read this a different way. Woe to the crown of pride, once again he's talking about crowns on heads, to the drunkards of Ephraim, whose glorious beauty is a fading plate. Now remember, glorious beauty. That phrase should be familiar to you from liturgical settings, but it's also in Exodus for glory and for beauty. That's what's used to talk specifically about the vestments worn by the priests. So, then it says, which are on the head of the fat valleys, though. What about valleys? That's the only difficult thing. Well, the word there might just be a misspelling, or it could be a pun, but it might be a misspelling for prideful one. So it could say, woe to the crown of pride to the drunkards of Ephraim. Once again, he's just been talking about pride. Woe to the crown of pride to the drunkards of Ephraim, whose glorious beauty is a fading plate. Talking about this fading plate that similar to what the high priest has on his head, right? But this presumably is a different one. They've replicated it because now there are multiple high priests, presumably. Whose glorious beauty is a fading plate, which is on the head of the fat, prideful ones, which is to say, those that are overcome with wine. So, you have this image here painted. He's just been talking about the temple in Jerusalem, but now he says, woe to those not at the temple of Jerusalem, woe to the priests at the other temple, who are wearing this other plate on their head, but it's fading. And they're these fat, arrogant people wearing this crown, but they're drunk all the time. They're trying to officiate at the temple, but they're drunk all the time. So then he says, behold, the Lord hath a mighty and strong one, which is a tempest of hail and a destroying storm, as a flood of mighty waters overflowing, shall cast down to the earth with the hand. Now, so this could be a pun about the flowers once again, that you have a rainstorm that's kind of flooding out the flowers. But it could also be the idea that God is going to wipe up, to clean up the wine and presumably the vomit that's kind of the image we're getting here of these drunk priests. So he says, behold, the Lord hath a mighty and strong one, which as a tempest of hail and a destroying storm, as a flood of mighty waters overflowing, shall cast down to the earth with the hand. So he's basically saying, I'm going to wipe out this fading flower. I'm going to wipe out this fading plate. These drunken priests, they're going to go wiped off the face of the earth. And once again, the flood imagery might be an allusion to Assyria. Remember that this is exactly what happens. Israel gets taken captive to Assyria when the Assyrians invade, and so they lose these holy places. They get destroyed. So, it says, the crown of pride, the drunkards of Ephraim, shall be trodden under feet, and the glorious beauty which is on the head of the fat valley, or perhaps the fat prideful ones, shall be a fading flower or a fading plate, and as the hasty fruit before the summer, which when he that looketh upon it seeth while it is yet in his hand, he eateth it up. In other words, when you have early fruit that ripens early, as soon as you don't go pick it with everything else, you take it early, you grab it, and you just consume it immediately. Because it's not like you went out to the field to go harvest a whole bunch of fruit for the day. No, you're just walking along, you see the ripe fruit, you grab it, you eat it, you go on your way. That's the kind of thing he's talking about here. And that's exactly what's going to happen to northern Israel, to Ephraim. Ephraim is going to be the first to go. A lot of Judah is going to fall into the Assyrian boot, but Ephraim's going to be the first to go. Just like something that's getting taken out early, just like fruit that is picked early and eaten before the rest of the crop is ripe. That's what's going to happen to these places. Now there's some indication that this may possibly be alluding to some things Hezekiah did in destroying various cultic sites, but the water imagery makes me say, this is probably the Assyrians. In 5 he says, "In that day shall the Lord of hosts be for a crown of glory and for a diadem of beauty unto the residue of his people." So instead of having these drunken priests with this replica of Aaron's, the high priestly plate on his head, the Lord of hosts is going to be a crown of glory and a diadem of beauty unto the residue of his people. And that's exactly the kind of thing that he's been depicting the whole time. Everybody is going to be like priests. And that's exactly what we see here. Now you can see why people might have tweaked the text, because some of this stuff that I'm giving you is actually from the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can see why people might have tweaked the text, because once again, this makes it very clear that there's a temple implications here, especially when read in the light of 27, he's just talking about the Temple of Jerusalem. So once again, it's uncomfortable for people to think that everybody could have these privileges, so he discounts it. So somebody has changed it, presumably for that reason. And he says he's not just going to be this glory, diadem of beauty. He says he's going to be for a spirit of judgment to him that sitteth in judgment, and for strength to them that turn the battle to the gate. So everyone is going to be kind of fill these priestly functions, the residue of the people, but they're also going to judge righteously, the spirit of judgment to them that sitteth in judgment, and the strength to them that turn the battle to the gate. So you have judge and warrior and priest all kind of rolled into one thing here. And God is going to be responsible for all of these functions for the people that are left in the land that aren't taken out by the Assyrians. And that's kind of a beautiful image. We get that kind of thing in the Book of Mormon. Redemption cometh in and through the Holy Messiah, for he is full of grace and truth. That phrase drags in imagery not only from priestly functions, but also possibly from warrior functions and also from kingly functions. The Book of Mormon is a loaded book. I suggest that you go back and read it very carefully next time you read it. Notice nuances in it. Like I said, that's just one verse that I read, and yet it brings up all three. The language is so loaded, it brings up all three of these images, just like we see here. It may even be actually riffing on some Isaiah 28 there in that verse. But what's great about this is that he's kind of classic Isaiah. He's just making fun of Ephraim and saying, these guys are ridiculous, but someday they're going to get wiped out and everything's going to be better. All of these people are going to assume the functions that were had by just these drunken northern priests. Isaiah is good every time. So let's continue. He continues to make fun of these guys in 7. "But they also have erred through wine, and through strong drink are out of the way. The priest and prophet have erred through strong drink. They're swallowed up of wine. They're out of the way through strong drink. They err in vision and stumble in judgment. For all tables are full of vomit and filthiness." Once again, just what I was talking about earlier, this idea of washing away the vomit. "So that there is no place clean. Whom shall he teach knowledge? And whom shall he make to understand doctrine? Them that are weaned from the milk and drawn from the breast. For precept must be upon precept. Precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little and there a little. For with stammering lips and another tongue will he speak to this people, to whom he said, This is the rest wherein ye cause the weary to rest, and this is the refreshing, yet they would not hear. But the word of the Lord was unto them precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line. Here a little and there a little, that they may go and fall backward, and be broken and snared and taken." So what does this mean here? This is a little bit difficult, maybe textually corrupt actually, but we'll talk about it. So once again, he's talking about them erring through wine. You have these drunken priests. It says the priest and prophet have erred through strong drink. So you have these drunken priests who are doing things they're not supposed to do in the temple. And so he says that they're swallowed up of wine. They're out of the way through strong drink. They err in vision and stumble in judgment. He says these guys are drunk all the time, but their drunkenness is destroying their visions. They're not able to do any of the functions they're supposed to fulfill. And notice he says priest and prophet. Presumably there was some prophecy that took place in connection with the temple. Isaiah is always talking about the temple, and there may be more people like him, prophets associated with the temple in some way. It's actually possible that Isaiah was a priest who was habitually in the temple. It's kind of a toss-up to know whether or not that's the case, but it is at least possible. So, but the priest and the prophet have just been drinking all the time. This has kind of destroyed their capability to judge or have visions. He says, for all tables are full of vomit and filthiness, so that there is no place clean. One of the major things about the temple that was so great is that it was always supposed to be ritually clean. And when periodically it was not ritually clean, you'd have the Day of Atonement to sort of clear it up. It seems that might have been something that just happened periodically, but then eventually became a yearly festival, although it's hard to say. But here, this ultimately clean place that's supposed to be ritually clean, instead, all the tables are full of vomit and filthiness, even presumably the table in the holy place where you're supposed to have the showbread, the bread that you present to God as part of the offering. Everything is full of vomit and filthiness. Everything is ritually unclean. So he says, okay, everything's ritually unclean, so whom shall he teach doctrine? Who's he going to teach? Now, the priests aren't going to cut it. And whom shall he make to understand doctrine? Them that are weaned from the milk and drawn from the breasts. In other words, he says, I have to start over now. The priests and prophets are not doing the right thing. I have to start over again with little kids, people that are just barely weaned from the milk and drawn from the breasts, as it were. Now remember, this is probably an allusion to the Samuel story. You remember that's what happens? Samuel, as soon as he basically is weaned practically, he's just this little kid, he's given to the Lord, and he lives in the temple in Shiloh. So this is, I think, probably a throwback to the Samuel story. The adults aren't doing it right. We need to raise up a new generation that will do it right. Because remember, Eli, in the Samuel story, Eli's not doing anything right. So God has to bring in Samuel to kind of take care of the problem. Samuel lives in the temple his whole life, works there, is raised by Eli, but apparently not much rubs off on him because Samuel remains a good guy. And he takes over and kind of fixes things. And so I think that's the allusion here. So he says, for precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little and there a little. In other words, he needs people to be raised up from when they're small so that they can learn things a little bit at a time. And because this is the problem. For with stammering lips and another tongue will he speak to this people. He might even say but with stammering lips and another tongue will he speak to this people. I may be able to start over and teach little kids a little bit at a time so that they can officiate in the temple. But with stammering lips and another tongue will he speak to this people. In other words, the Assyrians. People, they sound like they're stammering because they are speaking another language, right? With stammering lips and another tongue will he speak to this people. The Assyrians are going to come in and they're going to say things that nobody's going to like. So to whom he said, this is the rest wherewith ye may cause the weary to rest, and this is the refreshing, yet they would not hear. In other words, he taught them everything they were supposed to know. He taught them, but they didn't listen to him. The word of the Lord was supposed to be to make the weary rest. It was supposed to give them refreshing, give them rest, but they wouldn't listen. So he's bringing in the Assyrians, and they'll speak to them in another tongue. Maybe they'll listen to the Assyrians, kind of a thing. Once again, Isaiah just so mocking here. But his mockery is an equal opportunity pain, as my dad would say. Because he does this here to Ephraim, he's just about to do it to Judah too. So it kind of goes back and forth there. So, in other words, you didn't listen to me, well, you're definitely going to listen to the Assyrians, because you're going to have to. He says, but the word of the Lord was unto them precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little and there a little, that they may go and fall backward, and be broken, and snared, and taken. Now this is a little bit unsettling, but it goes back to things that we've been talking about before. He had taught them. They didn't listen, but he had taught them. And because he had taught them, they were responsible enough, they knew enough, that they're going to be taken over, fall backward, be broken, and snared, and taken. Once again, fall backward. You remember the Eli story? This is an obscure detail, so you may not remember it. So Samuel goes to live at the temple. He's working with Eli. Eli does a bunch of things he's not supposed to do. Samuel kind of takes over as the good guy, kind of leading things there at the Shiloh tabernacle. And Eli, however, they get punished for their sins, and the Ark of the Covenant gets taken. And when Eli is told about this, what happens? He literally falls backward and breaks his neck. Okay? He's a fat old guy, and when he hears that the Ark has been taken, he literally falls backwards off the bench he's sitting on and breaks his neck. He kind of hits the wall and breaks his neck. Okay? And so that's, once again, I think another allusion to the Eli story. These people should have known better. They learned everything they needed to learn, at least enough. Were given enough rope to hang themselves, in other words. And remember, back in Isaiah 6, the idea is that Judah not be given this. That's why Isaiah maybe doesn't say everything exactly directly like he would have, because he's told specifically in chapter 6 not to. That's Jesus' interpretation, and I'm going to run with that. So, I think that's what we're seeing here. Once again, an allusion to the Eli story, but also these people knew what they were supposed to do. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. So they're going to get taken out by the Assyrians, and I'm going to start over again. And then we see exactly what happened here. Wherefore, so I was talking about, he then immediately goes and lays into Jerusalem too. Wherefore hear the word of the Lord, ye scornful men that rule this people which is in Jerusalem. Because you've said, we made a covenant with death, and with hell we're at agreement. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come unto us, for we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood have we hid ourselves. Therefore thus saith the Lord God, behold, I lay in Zion for a foundation stone, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. He that believeth shall not make haste. Judgment also will I lay to the line, and righteousness to the plummet, and the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and water shall overflow the hiding place. So he's in the earlier sections making fun of Israel. Now he's making fun of Judah. The scornful men that rule this people which is in Jerusalem. These people who think that nothing bad is going to happen to him. He says, well, not so much. You've said we made an agreement with death, and with hell we're at agreement. You made a covenant with death, and with hell we're at agreement. Now, remember, these are pagan deities. Death is Mot, the pagan god of death. Canaanite god. We talked about him before. He swallows everything, right? So we've seen that image. So in other words, they say, we're going to be just fine, because we, instead of with Jehovah, we made a covenant with Mot. And with hell, with Sheol, the underworld, we have an understanding with those guys. So when the overflowing scourge shall pass through, this giant wave overflowing everything that we saw earlier in the chapter, it's not going to come to us. We're fine. We're hiding under lies. We've made lies our refuge, and under falsehood have we hid ourselves. Right? This kind of ridiculous image of them cowering behind their own lies when this flood is passing through. So presumably the covenant they've made is a false covenant with death and hell, and they know it. But they think, but this lie is going to save us. And of course Isaiah knows it's a lie. He knows it's ridiculous, but they still think it's going to save them. He says, therefore thus saith the Lord God, behold, I lay in Zion for a foundation stone, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. He that believeth shall not make haste. In other words, you guys are going to hide behind your lies? Well, God has laid in Zion a giant cornerstone, a giant building that you guys can hide behind to stay safe. But he that doesn't believe, and so he that believes is going to be safe. He's not going to make haste. He's not going to have to run away, flee before this overflowing scourge that comes through the land. He's going to hide behind the thing that is going to save him, Jehovah. And he that doesn't believe is going to be out of luck. And once again, this stone, the temple is built on this mountain. The temple in Jerusalem is built on this mountain, and there's a stone that sticks out in the middle. And there are lots of traditions surrounding the stone, but it's very clear that this outcropping, this stony outcropping, was a place where a theophany happened, where an angel showed up, almost destroyed Jerusalem, didn't destroy Jerusalem, and so David started offering sacrifices there, and that became the site for the temple. That's what the text states pretty clearly. So he's saying, I have a stone, presumably the stone of the temple, that's going to save you. He says, judgment also will I lay to the line, and righteousness to the plummet, and the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters shall overflow the hiding place. Because you have to understand something about ancient building procedures to really make sense of this. So back in the day, in order to make sure that stones you were using for buildings were square, they would have something called a line and plummet, which is just a piece of string with a weight tied to the end. And obviously the weight always makes the string hang down perfectly. Gravity is just one of those things. So the line is always going to be straight. And you can use this line to make sure that the stones you're building with are perfectly straight. You can imagine, if you're building with big stones, it might look like it's perfectly straight side to side, but you would not actually know for sure without some kind of instrument. So imagine you have something that isn't exactly perfect, then you go to put it in place, and you find that it isn't exactly perfect. Well, you just wasted yourself a lot of time. So it says, judgment also I will lay to the line, and I might even say justice, right? Justice is might be a better translation there from the Hebrew. So the idea is that it's perfectly straight. So justice is always perfectly straight. Justice will I lay to the line, and righteousness to the plummet. The plummet is the weight at the bottom. So righteousness is the thing that's always consistent, that makes sure that justice always is straight, right? And the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and the water shall overflow the hiding place. So, I mean, the image is kind of hilarious that you have somebody there kind of leisurely building this building, having this sure foundation for people to be on. And he's kind of, continuously working on this with his little building materials, his line and plummet. But while he's on this good ground, making a good foundation stone that isn't going to get washed away by the flood, the waters come and wash away everything else. Okay, so the good people that are siding with Jehovah are going to be totally safe. They have a sure foundation. Everybody else gets washed away. Not terribly dissimilar to the parable we get in the New Testament. I know it mostly from the song, But the wise man and the foolish man, when the wise man builds his house on the rock, the foolish man builds his house on the sand. When the rains come and beat on the house, the foolish man's house gets washed away. This is very, very similar, and Jesus may actually just be elaborating on that idea here in Isaiah 28. So then Isaiah continues, "And your covenant with death shall be disannulled, and your agreement with hell shall not stand. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, then ye shall be trodden down by it." So I'm the only one that can save you, in other words. That's what God's saying. Nobody else is going to save you. You think Mot is going to save you? The Canaanite god of death? He's not going to save you. Any agreements you've made with the underworld? They're not going to save you. This overflowing scourge is going to wipe you away, being trodden down by it. Remember, he was talking about the crown being trodden down earlier. Now everybody's being trodden down by the Assyrian force. From the time that it goeth forth, it shall take you. For morning by morning shall it pass over, by day and by night, and there shall be a vexation only to understand the report. For the bed is shorter than a man can stretch himself on it, and the covering narrower than that he can wrap himself in it. For the Lord shall rise up as in Mount Perazim, he shall be wroth as in the valley of Gibeon, that he may do his work, his strange work, and bring to pass his act, his strange act. Now therefore be ye not mockers, lest your bands be made strong. For I have heard from the Lord God of hosts a consumption, even determined, upon the whole earth. Now this is kind of an interesting verse. Let's look carefully at what we get in this passage. So he says, "From the time that it goeth forth, it shall take you. For morning by morning shall it pass over, by day and by night, and it shall be a vexation only to understand the report." So in other words, every single day, this is going to hit you over and over and over again, this overflowing scourge. Once again, the flood imagery, it's like a flood that's just coming over and over again. And unless you have a really, really good foundation, the house is just going to get weaker and weaker every time. And not only does it come every morning, it goes all day and all night. It's continuously hitting and hitting and hitting the house over and over again. And it says it'll be a vexation only to understand the report. The destruction is going to be so amazing, you won't even be able to grasp what's happening. For the bed is shorter than that a man can stretch himself on it, and the covering narrower than he can wrap himself in it. And this also makes a lot of sense in the context that the area that Israel enjoys just keeps getting smaller and smaller. Israel doesn't have a chance to stretch out, if you will. Remember, the Assyrians just keep expanding a little bit at a time, and suddenly the space that Israel and Judah have to stretch out, as it were, is getting smaller and smaller. And they're becoming continuously worried about this. You don't have enough room. The coverings are too small to wrap yourself in. The bed is getting shorter and shorter. You don't have any room to do anything. It's really a fantastic image. And for the Lord shall rise up as in Mount Perazim. Now this is an interesting reference. We need to talk about this briefly. So what we get here is Mount Perazim. Yeah, like I said, kind of strange references. But these are both battles that took place at somewhat close at the same time of David against the Philistines. But notice the context here. It says, "The Lord shall rise up as in Mount Perazim." In other words, back in the day, he rose up with David to fight his enemies, which at the time were the Philistines, at Perazim and Gibeon. But this time, he's not doing that. He's rising up with the Assyrians against Israel and Judah. And that's why this is his work, a strange work, that he may do his work, his strange work. It's unusual. It's different than what happened before. It's not exactly the same as, Israel and Judah are really just combined Israel at that time, is going up against the Philistines, God's enemies. God is getting the Assyrians to go against his enemies, which are, at this point, Israel and Judah. That's why it's a strange work and a strange act that he's bringing about. So it says, "Now therefore be ye not mockers, lest your bands be made strong." You should listen to me right now. Don't make fun of this, or you guys will be turned into slaves. Because I've heard this directly from the Lord, that this overflowing scourge is coming through the entire land. So, he says, listen to me now. As we get here to 23. Give ye ear, and hear my voice. Hearken and hear my speech. Doth the plowman plow all day to sow? Doth he open and break the clods of his ground? When he hath made plain the face thereof, doth he not cast abroad the fitches, and scatter the cumin, and cast in the principal wheat, and the appointed barley, and the rye in their place? For his God doth instruct him to discretion, and doth teach him. For the fitches are not threshed with a threshing instrument, neither is a cartwheel turned about upon the cumin, but the fitches are beaten out with a staff, and the cumin with a rod. Bread corn is bruised, because he will not ever be threshing it, nor break it with the wheel of his cart, nor bruise it with his horsemen. This also cometh forth from the Lord of hosts, which is wonderful in counsel, and excellent in working. Yep, I know. It's okay. We'll talk about it. So, he basically says emphatically now, listen to me, guys, in 23. Doth the plowman plow all day to sow? So this, I think, is supposed to be a note of hope here. Do people that plow fields, do they just plow all day? Doesn't he also eventually sow? Doesn't he open up the earth eventually to sow his field? Is he always just plowing? Well, no, he's not always plowing. He eventually sows. And that's something that we get kind of from the Dead Sea Scrolls that makes it a little bit clearer. This chapter actually, it's just bits and pieces, but it does rely somewhat heavily on the Dead Sea Scrolls. So yeah, does a man that plows always plow? Is he just continuously opening the ground? He says no. Once he's leveled it out, doesn't he cast abroad these various seeds, kind of plants that you would use for spices, generally speaking? But notice he says, does he cast abroad the fitches and scatter the cumin and cast in the principal wheat and the appointed rye and the barley in their place? Or the Dead Sea Scrolls, he might say, when he's leveled it all out, doesn't he throw in the smaller seeds, the caraway seed and the cumin seed, but then put the wheat in rows and the barley in its own place and the spelt around the outside in its place? So you see a separation. He just scatters these little plant seeds, these little spice seeds in one place, but he very orderly plants everything else. Okay? And presumably in different portions of the field. For his God instructs him aright and teaches him. So he says, this is the right thing to do. For caraway is not, you can't thresh caraway with a sharp threshing instrument, and you can't roll a cartwheel over cumin. Caraway's got to be beaten out with a stick, and cumin has to be beaten out with a stick as well. Different kinds of sticks there, it's a parallelism. So this is kind of an interesting idea. The idea that you have one part of the field where you do one thing, where you have just standard instruments that you use for the things that you put in this section. But then over in this part of the field, you do things differently. You beat it out with a staff and you hit it with a rod. He then, and this is kind of one big analogy about Israel and Judah. I'll explain in a second. He says, it is ground in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but you don't always have to thresh it. His cart and his horses might scatter it, but you don't grind it there. In other words, you can't just go in with your horse and cart and just kind of manhandle it like you would wheat, which has much bigger seeds. You have to do it delicately. Yeah, you hit it, but you're doing it delicately so that it will survive and that it will drop the seeds the way you want it. You don't want to crush the seeds into oblivion, which is what you would do by using normal agricultural methods on it. It says, this also comes from the Lord of hosts, who is distinguished in counsel and excellent in wisdom. In other words, he says, this is the way it's supposed to be. But what does that mean? Once again, even once you kind of know what he's talking about, it's a little bit confusing. But the idea is, you have the spices and everything over here. You have your regular grains over here. But when I do the spices, when I harvest the spices, I beat it differently. I harvest it differently. You can't just roll over it because you'll crush it. You have to beat it. And I think that's really the idea here. God saying, well, listen, guys, I know that this is really, really bad. This seems really terrible. But these things are going to work out for you. There are times when I really had to plow everything. And the Assyrians I'm bringing in, they're going to plow everything under. And they're going to level everything. But then, you don't plow forever. You eventually plant. And I'm going to plant people in the right places to be exactly how they need to be. And when it's time to gather everything in, once again, this is very, very similar to things we've seen in the past. When I gather everything in, I'm not going to completely destroy everything. I'm going to be gentle. Yes, it's going to feel, when I gather you, it's also going to feel like I'm smacking you around. You hit it with a rod, it says. You hit these seeds with a rod. But you don't run over it with a cart and completely destroy it like you do with other threshing instruments. They used to have these carts with these big old metal boards with teeth on the bottom that would just tear everything up so that you could get all the grain loose. And he says you can't do that with spices. You have to be a little bit more delicate. And so I think that's what we're getting here. Yes, I'm going to bring the Assyrians in to level everything, but then I'm going to plant. And when it's time to harvest, I'm not going to harvest just brutally. I'm going to carefully go up to each plant and beat it and gather the seeds and bring everything in. So I think that this is actually supposed to be a note of hope. That even though things are really bad right now, this is not the end of things. Yeah, he's leveling everything out right now, but he's going to plant, and then he's going to harvest. And when he harvests, he's not going to be so brutal. He's going to make sure that Israel and Judah survive and are gathered back in. Now that is really key, because we'll see this later on as a motif of God kind of gathering and bringing everything back in. But here we see it starting to begin, this motif of God gathering everybody in. And he uses agricultural motifs, which also we see in the Book of Mormon, incidentally. Probably not incidentally, actually. But this is the kind of image that we're seeing right now. So remember that there is unity here from chapter 28, from chapter 27 into chapter 28. He's been talking about all these things being destroyed. Someday everybody's going to gather to Jerusalem, but this other temple in northern Israel is not going to be saved. These people are going to be in bad, bad shape, these people that have abused the worship, these drunk priests. And so that's what we see here. But he says, I am going to start over again. And I'm going to allow other people to learn these things. And everybody is going to be able to be like a priest. We've gotten this over and over again. But that's what we see here. Everybody's going to be able to be like a priest. And the proud, those that did things the wrong way, well, they're going to get blown away by the Assyrians. But those that trust in the Lord, they're going to be with him in his temple, and they're going to be safe. And I think that, once again, the message is very, very applicable to us. You see so often people doing things the way that they're just not supposed to do them, and it looks like everything is just fine for them. And you say to yourself, well, these guys are doing everything wrong. How are they being blessed? Well, God says, well, eventually that's not going to be the way it is. These people that are doing things wrong are going to be punished, and those that trust in the Lord are not going to be washed away when the flood comes through. They're going to be just fine. God is going to beat up on people for sure. But if you trust in him, you'll be just fine. And eventually, this is going to be over. Eventually, the chaos is going to end, and God is going to gather everyone back in. Going to gather them to himself at the temple, which is what he was just talking about in the last chapter. And he's not going to completely destroy them. He is going to gently gather them in. And I think that for us, this is exactly what we all hope for. We hope that when we trust in God, even though things might be difficult, we'll be okay. And that even for those times when we don't trust in God, and heaven knows there are enough of those, God will still not completely destroy us. He will gather us in gently. He won't completely obliterate us in his attempts to gather us in. He will carefully and tenderly gather us back in so that we can eventually be with him. And I think that's the message that Isaiah wants us to get here. Now, a lot of people would say that this kind of thing should come later, that maybe this is even a later insertion. Once again, I don't think so. I think that Isaiah knows what's coming. He also knows what they're in the middle of right now. The Assyrians are indeed taking people away. But this is just seen as a plowing and planting so that God can eventually harvest. And really, even though this is on a national level, I think we all experience this individually. We feel spiritually scattered. And God says, no, I'm going to carefully and tenderly bring you back in so that you can be with me and indeed be with him in the celestial kingdom. So that's it for Isaiah 28. I hope you enjoyed that. Some kind of interesting tidbits about worship in northern Israel and some interesting translation issues. And next time we're going to continue. Isaiah is going to just keep on keeping on, laying into Jerusalem. But thankfully, we have some Joseph Smith translation to help us next time. So that's it for today, and we will see you guys next time.